Now the first step in most of my paintings is bringing in a little bit of clean water, so I'm doing that now using a mist bottle. Not too much, just enough to allow the paint to flow and move around. Now I've chosen this reference photo to work from today. It's the estuary in Devon. There's not much going on in there, but I really like the sky and I like the reflections across the water. I'll probably add something for a little bit of interest, maybe some boats or something like that. Now I've got my board at about a 20-degree angle, which I do for probably 99% of my paintings. That also allows the paint to move around and stops water puddling on the surface. And so I'll start by working on the sky, and I've picked up some blue, some cobalt and a little bit of French ultramarine. And so I'll bring some of that in. I can lay that into the water that's already there from the mist bottle. And now it's, like I said, there's not too much water on there so that it runs straight down, but just enough so I'll get those nice soft edges. And now I'll reflect some of that sky down into the land area as well. So pretty much everything I do in the sky I'm going to reflect down across those mud flats. Now I've introduced a small amount of raw sienna into that blue. And there's some slightly silvery tones going on in that sky, and I think that's best achieved with a mixture of raw sienna and blue. So I can lay some of that in there. Now I don't always follow the reference exactly. There's not really any point. I want to try and make a painting. I'm not trying to copy the photo exactly. I'm not a photorealist painter. I'm more impressionistic in my approach, so I can be very loose with it. I can play around with it. I can move things around. And so laid some of that colour into the sky, again mirrored that down across these mud flats. So touching in some of that raw sienna and blue mixture while it's all still wet. And now before everything dries off too much, I've picked up some Payne's grey and touched a little bit of blue into that, and I'm going to get some of those darker cloud shapes up in the sky now. So a little bit more Payne's grey, touch a little bit of burnt sienna into that as well for some variation. I can bring that in, touch in some of the areas that I've already put in, also leaving some tiny little white areas behind as well. Get some of that glow up in the sky. A little bit more Payne's grey, a little bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more of that ultramarine as well. Let's bring in quite a dark cloud shape here. So bringing that down, the paper's still slightly damp. It's drying quite quickly today, so I'm working fairly quick. Don't want any hard edges to form. And then as I come down towards the horizon, I can make these shapes slightly smaller, a little bit more horizontal. So I'm having a glance at the reference photo, squinting my eyes, and like I said, don't try and copy it exactly, just try and get a feel for what's going on there and making my own composition from the information I have in that reference photo. And this is a similar way of working to how I'd work if I was working on location. So working very quickly, trying to get as much done in the first wash as possible while everything's still wet, so I achieve all those soft edges, everything blurred together, and that creates a nice sense of cohesion in the painting. If I dried every section before trying to lay something over the top, I'd get a lot of hard edges, and I don't really want that. So let's get some of this slightly darker paint down across these mud flats. So reflecting some of the dark from these clouds down into the land. And that's dried quite quickly down there, so I've got a few little broken edges happening, but I can work with that. I quite like that. And so that's that dry brush effect happening, and that gives a nice little bit of sparkle across the land there. Now I'll swap to a slightly smaller brush. I've picked up some cobalt blue and I'll touch that with some alizarin. And so I'm mixing up a colour for that row of trees off in the distance there. Now they're quite dark in the reference, but I don't necessarily want to copy that too much. It will bring them closer, they'll appear closer. So I've made them slightly bluer. And so mixed up a little bit of a mauve type colour with the alizarin and the blue. And looking at that shape of those trees and bringing it over all in one go. I don't want to try and paint hundreds of individual trees off there in the distance. And you can treat anything that's in a distance as one big shape and it should read. So bring that shape all the way across, tapering down to almost nothing on the left hand side there. And let's pick up a little bit more of that Payne's grey, bit of burnt sienna. Mix a little bit of that grey in the palette into that as well. And I'll try and get some of these little darker elements down in the foreground. Now, I don't want to overcomplicate that, so I think I'll just drag in with the brush and then maybe get some little dry brush things happening as well. I've put those in a little bit too hard edge, so let's just soften those off a little bit. Just drag across very lightly with the brush, join them all together, make little connections between it all. Now I'm starting to deviate from the reference a tiny little bit. I'm adding things that aren't necessarily there, but that's fine. I'm building up a composition that's balanced. I've kind of suggested a shadow coming across the land in the foreground, and now I'm getting some little bits of texture across these mud flats, whilst the whole time making sure I don't cover up too much of that light. That little bit of sparkly dry brush I've got just left to centre there in the land, I like that, so I want to try and keep some of that. And now before this dries out, across this row of trees, let's just introduce some slightly darker paint across there. Creates a little bit of separation between that row of trees and the land. Okay, I've completely dried that first wash, and now I've kind of painted everything in the reference, but it's a little bit boring, so I'm going to bring in some boats on the right hand side. Now I'm completely making this up, and I want to introduce a little bit of interest, and so I'm playing around with the composition. Let's bring in a tiny little bit of water with the mist bottle. Not too much, just the lightest little spray there really. And I'll bring in a little group of boats, I think, right out here on the right hand side. So let's bring in one fairly dark. And now let's pick up some grey out of the palette there, touch a little bit of burnt sienna into that. And I can join this shape together. Let's have another boat sitting there just behind it. Make that slightly lighter in tone. It's got a lighter shape next to a darker shape. If I'd put that all in as one big dark shape, it would have been a little bit too imposing, I think. So mix it up. Little areas of light next to little areas of dark. And let's bring in a little bit of raw sienna. And maybe there's just a jumble of stuff there. Little bits of tarpaulin or little boxes, maybe little lobster pots or whatever they are. Just a little jumble of things. And let's have another boat, slightly larger boat there. Can almost taper that down to nothing. And again, another little pile of little bits and pieces there, but join that all together as one big shape, connect it down into the land. Just touch a little bit of dark across the top of that boat and across the bottom there. And so really bringing in those few very simple little shapes. I've created some interest there on the right hand side. And then join that all in, drag some dark across. Very light touch with the brush, dragging on little textural areas now. And switch to a rigger brush. And pick up some of that dark paint in the palette. Doesn't really matter what colour, just make it dark. And now I'll put a couple of masts on these boats. Nothing more than a little line. So a few little things in there. Whatever it is, I mean, you can just get away with putting a little jumble of things in there. And your eye knows what it's looking at. And so let's introduce some reflections from these masts. Very light touch again, drag some paint down. I'll soften that with my finger. And just by putting in a reflection of a mast there, it instantly makes that area look slightly wetter. And so this little upright on a boat there, again I can drag that down to create a very simple reflection. I don't want to make too much of that. Now while I've got that dark paint, I think I'll put a figure in. So place the head roughly on that horizon line and bring in a very simple silhouette of a figure there. And that helps to give the scene a little bit of scale. Bringing in a very tiny silhouette of a figure, it makes the whole scene seem quite a lot bigger. And I can reflect some of that down as well. Let's pick up some darker paint. I'll make that figure a little bit darker, so it stands out that little bit more. Don't have to do too much at all really. Little dot for the head and then tiny little shape for the torso, and then drag down for the legs. Can join that all together. And a tiny little bit of paint across the bottom of the feet to tie into the land. And so the painting's taking shape already. A very simple scene has become a little bit more complex and it's got a little bit more interest about it as well. So let's swap back to slightly larger brush. I think I need some colour across these mud flats. It's looking a little bit too plain, so a little bit of pretty much neat raw sienna. Drag some of that in. Now there's not really much in the way of colour across the land in the reference, but I think it's quite nice to add a bit of raw sienna. It's quite nice the way it sits next to the blue and the greys. It's quite complementary, I think. Let's go back into the rigger brush. I think I'll put a few masts in as well, off in the distance. And now again, they're not in the reference, but it adds a little bit of interest in the distance there. Also acts as a little bit of a stopper on this left hand side. Now let's put a few more, a little bit closer. Okay, let's get a little bit of interest up in the sky. So I'll drop in a couple of tiny marks in the sky, a couple of birds. I can soften that shape with my finger as well. Again, don't want to make too much of these, but again, it's a tiny little bit of interest in the sky. Okay, I've dried the painting completely and it's the finished piece, and I'm quite happy with it, to be honest. I think it was a very basic reference photo with not much going on, but by getting a little bit more drama in the sky, darkening that land slightly, but then bringing in the shapes of the boats and the figure and the boats off in the distance and a couple of tiny little birds up in the sky, really brings that scene to life. And so if you've got a reference and there's not a huge amount going on, but there's something about it you like I like the sky in this one, but there's something that you like about it, then do paint the scene and then think about adding something to it for a little bit more interest. And maybe you could find another reference photo with some boats in it and superimpose those over the top, but have a play around anyway. But anyway, I hope you liked the demo. If you did, let me know, send me a comment, all that kind of stuff, and check me out over on Patreon where I've got exclusive videos every week. But anyway, thanks for watching as always, everybody, and I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.